Thank you so much for being here. We're really looking forward to spending the day with you all. And I'm Karin Kettenring. I'm a professor at Utah State University. I'm a wetland ecologist. And the day today is a collaboration between a lot of people who you will hear from in waves today up here with our various panels and also out in the field. We know a lot of you have a deep interest in revegetation, potentially a lot of experience, or maybe you're here because you want to learn a lot from your peers around you. We also have some native plant vendors and seed collectors as well. So part of our goal is to start a lot of conversations and continue a lot of conversations among all of you today. So thanks for getting those name tags on, and please feel free to just start up conversations with those around you. So we're going to, for the first hour and a half or so this morning, we're going to have a series of 3 topics, and we've got a rotating panel here. We are actually recording this so that we can have these resources available for people in the future as well. So if there's a little bit of awkwardness in our transitions, that's why, because we're mostly scientists and not production experts. So our topic today, improving wetland revegetation in the Intermountain West. We're going to hear from people's experiences, hear about the challenges that we're all facing, and some of the uncertainties that we're trying to address in what we are doing. And then hopefully this will advance. And if not, we'll try a new, there we go. So as you know, we have 3 areas that we're going to focus on today. What plant species might you want to be using in revegetation? We have our folks here, Keith Hambrecht, Jeff Klausmann, Blake Wellard on the end there, and then Shane Sterner, who will be talking in succession here. We also talk about the trade-offs of using plugs and seeds and sod mats, and then the timelines required for seeding and planting, both from the installations side of things, but also if you are working with vendors, how do you make sure you get what you need in the time that you need it? So that's a really key consideration. So why these questions and why today? Most of you probably have heard from us one way or another, either from the surveys that we did in 2022 and 2023 of state and federal managers asking about the revegetation practices and challenges. And then at the same time, we were doing a survey of native plant vendors in the Intermountain West. So we have a couple of publications that resulted from this. A number of the co-authors on these papers are in the audience today. In addition to that, though, Lauren Taylor, who's standing behind the camera there, is a current master's student in my lab, and she's been doing interviews of wetland managers in the Great Salt Lake watershed. I understand that many of you here today have actually given an interview to her. We greatly appreciate your time, and thank you all for sharing your knowledge, because I think we all benefit from that. What we heard from you all is that there are many challenges to revegetation and providing those seeds and plants for restoration. We also have been hearing how much of a need there is for knowledge sharing and for collaboration. So that's really what today is about and why we're recording today. And we're just looking forward to a great day. So thank you again for being here. So for this first topic, what plant species to use in revegetation, I'm going to just provide a little bit of context before you hear from the experts here. When we surveyed state and federal managers, we asked, why are you revegetating? And these are the primary goals, this list here. The first of which was actually for erosion control, but also, of course, for limiting invasive species, providing avian and pollinator habitat, and improving water quality. There also are additional goals that I would say we are pushing as well, is that we want to be avoiding homogenization, meaning that we don't want all our restorations to be looking the same. We have a handful of species that we know work well in revegetation, but we're also pushing to incorporate a lot more diversity and try to capture some of the dwindling diversity that we're seeing. We're losing a lot of our unique wetlands, here in real time, and so can we capture that diversity and get it into our restoration? And that's part of what Blake will talk about today. Also, what your goals are will obviously depend on what's possible. Site environmental conditions greatly constrain what you might be able to do, and we heard over and over again from people about how water availability was such a huge issue for being able to seed and plant and establish species successfully. Of course, it also depends on how degraded your site is, what is going to be possible there, what species you could even establish, as well as the larger context of your watershed. And then we heard how much capacity is limiting what people are able to do in terms of revegetation, budgets, personnel, equipment. So that's part of what the sharing knowledge is about, is helping with some of those capacity challenges. On the other hand, what people are revegetating also, of course, depends on what is available out there. There's some wetland species that are easy to get, very easy to work with. We call these workhorse species, and these are the common species like saltgrass that you can see in that photo there, hardstem bulrush, alkali bulrush, that are doing really well for the most part. But then again, if we have this goal of trying to bring in more diversity, there are quite a few species that just aren't available. From surveying vendors, there are many reasons for that. In some cases, it was because they were species that maybe were just not super familiar. We may not know about their species biology or their production needs. But more often than not, it was many of these other factors, like weather extremes impacting supplies, or in the vast majority of cases, it's just too costly and speculative for vendors to invest a lot of time in species that might be more boutique species and there's not a lot of demand for. Many of these are small businesses with small profit margins, and market fluctuations, in particular a lack of contracts. If there aren't contracts to ensure that somebody's going to buy that rare species, it's just not worth their effort. So now we're going to transition to hearing from each of our panelists here. Keith is going to start off and talk about some of his experiences with forestry, fire, and state lands and some of these workhorse species.
Hi, everyone. So Karin asked me to talk about workhorse species. I think that's appropriate because the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands manages the bed of Utah Lake, Jordan River, and Great Salt Lake. All three of those water bodies have been heavily invaded with Phragmites. So Utah Lake had about 10,000 acres. Great Salt Lake in 2012 had 20 to 30,000 acres. It's likely expanded a lot since then. And then the Jordan River has about 170 acres lining the river corridor. So in addition to Phragmites, we've been experiencing these extreme drought conditions. Then in the last 2 seasons, we had this record snowpack and flooding conditions. So we have all these incredibly challenging, pretty extreme conditions, and then also massive scale. And so although our long-term goals are to promote biodiversity in these wetlands and increase function of the wetlands, increase habitat, we really need workhorse species just because of the scale of our effort. And so inland saltgrass has really been our best workhorse species thus far. We're having a lot of success germinating it, and we're seeing it survive some really extreme conditions from, completely flooded to bone dried, completely flooded again, extreme temperatures. And so we're kind of aiming to do sort of managed succession in a lot of these areas where if we can get a lot of saltgrass established very quickly in places where we've removed Phragmites, or there's anywhere there's a threat of Phragmites reinvading or moving in, hopefully we can keep at least one of the variables at bay, the invasive species at bay, and then from there, once we have our inland saltgrass established, we're hoping we'll have a better chance of succeeding in bringing in that biodiversity because there'll be a lot less threats.
Okay, and now we're going to hear from Blake Wellard from Salt Lake County, and just for all the panelists, maybe just try to lean in a little bit more. Let me see if we can, you are taller. There we go. How's that?
Yeah, that should work well. We're good. All right. So as Karin mentioned, we are losing wetland diversity very quickly. I would equate this diversity loss as losing a piece to a puzzle. We're trying to do restoration without all of the pieces. And we don't exactly know what our restoration targets are. We're down to the last remaining wetland reference systems across the Wasatch Front. Most of those are privately owned. So, and with some of the recent changes to wetland law, these wetlands are no longer safe from development. So over the past 13 years or so, I've been kind of obsessed with tracking all of these wetland reference ecosystems down, learning about what species diversity these wetlands still hold, and trying to figure out how to propagate it and capture that biodiversity while we still have materials available. So these wetland systems fortunately have been well documented through time, but because so many of these were documented early on, we're just looking at species lists, and it's hard to understand how those species fit into a context of a system. So I am, to this day, thank you, Walter Cottam. All his work in 1922 to 1926 was focused on documenting wetland systems around Utah Lake. And by some miracle, I can still find roughly 90% of everything Walter Cottam observed in the 20s. But it's all in very small fragmented spaces. But fortunately, some of these are healthy enough that it's still capturing the community dynamics and the species associations and the habitat zones within the wetland that they occupy. So I am trying to work with all of wetland practitioners, trying to bring awareness to these spaces, working with Karin's lab and working with Keith, trying to capture as much of this biodiversity, because without some of this biodiversity, we are at risk of having homogenized systems, and we are at risk of having secondary invasion after we treat the Phragmites. And unfortunately, with so many of these systems that we're working with right now, they're at a state of degradation that even after herbicide treatment, the natives are not coming back. So I'd really like to stress all of you to get to know what our restoration targets might actually look like. And I want to help you become familiar with some of this biodiversity that these spaces hold. And as soon as we can, try to get as much quantitative data and photographs so that if we do lose these systems, we know how to recreate them. Because these are systems that are still supporting probably 95% native plant cover. A century later, these are extremely resilient systems. We're not losing this diversity simply due to climate change factors. It's largely due to human activity. These species still belong in the landscape and have a place. And just with the limited time I have available, I'll try to highlight a few of these. Not going to read these off, but I'm just going to highlight a couple that I'm particularly excited about. If any of you want to grab me, I'll be happy to talk to you about any of these. But these are a handful of species that I'm presently working on. But we have a need to have species that can occupy transitional spaces. We need things that can be in emergent condition and be able to dry out. Saltgrass is one of those, but this is another species that I think we all need to be propagating a lot more of. This is sluice sedge, reported as being very common in the 20s by Walter Cottam around Utah Lake. It was first collected on the Jordan River in 1869. This is the only sexually functional population that I'm aware of, and it's one I created. This is at a wetland in Salt Lake City. And I'm finally getting enough seeds of our local plant material that I have material to share. But sluice sedge can grow in water up to 1 meter deep, but it can also be high and dry for long periods of time, as Keith has discovered at the north end of Utah Lake. Another one I'm very excited about is river bulrush. River bulrush is a new one for me. I've been on the hunt for it for a while. It's widely scattered in Utah, but I would consider this one that is under investigation. This is a very large species. It can get 8 feet tall or more. It can compete right alongside our cattails and hardstem bulrush and American bulrush communities, or common 3-square. And I'm really interested in making this plant material more available. Picture here on the left was with Karin's, a class that Karin was teaching, field botany class, and we're all admiring the river bulrush. And you can see a few of the students down in there, and a couple of those people are 6 feet tall, so that particular patch was at least 6 feet tall. So emergent forb, we're so focused on emergent aquatic communities, I really want to focus on adding some more ecological value to our emergent marsh communities. So I'd like to highlight 2 species here. So this is what I would consider one of our most imperiled forbs on the Wasatch Front. It was even uncommonly observed historically, but when you know where to look, it tends to show up. And this particular individual was growing in a marsh dominated by cattail. It's growing in about 30 centimeters of water, blooms early in the season, and it is of critical importance to a bee of local conservation concern that Utah State Bee Lab has been focused on for a while, the Macropsis bee, or Macropus. I think I added an S. But this is strongly clonal, easy to propagate. It's thrived in all of my restoration plantings, and I'd love to see that something like this included in the emergent zones. Another one that I was very happy to see was included in the very recent book put out by the wetland working group at the state, I can't think of their name, so apologize. But C.M. suave. So this was not commonly observed. Walter Cottam did not see it in the 20s at Utah Lake, but it is spread throughout wetland systems in the valley. And this is a wonderful species that can be right alongside cattails and hardstem bulrush in water up to 1/2 meter in depth. Has the dimorphic leaf, so if you see it early in the spring, you'll think you're dealing with a true submergent aquatic like a Stuckenia. It has a tendency to look like Stuckenia with long filiform dissected leaves, but then it puts up this rather large stem up to 5 feet tall, and this plant is an excellent larval host, great for pollinators, really good to add some higher ecological value to these emergent marsh spaces. So the community I spent probably much of my time in is the meadow and graminoid forb communities that is often the boundary between the emergent marsh, is particularly within Utah Lake and just a handful of Great Salt Lake wetlands left. So I'll highlight a few of those. This is really one of importance right now. Monarch butterflies need this. I'm guessing probably more than half of you have been lucky enough to encounter this wandering around some of our wetlands. But swamp milkweed is a very good species, easy to propagate, probably a very easy one to farm, and it can tolerate inundation, likes to be in the wettest zones, but it's also quite tolerant of being high and dry for long periods of time. So it does have some drought resiliency, but the only things that I see can kick it out in those drier situations is if it experiences too much competition. But it has a really high seed output and it's tolerant of a wide range of soil conditions. There is many observations here at the wetland we're visiting today, but I would strongly encourage all of you to start considering the use of swamp milkweed. But I also want to provide this species because this is a window into the past. These wetlands that I'm talking about have a lot of similarities to Great Plains wetland systems, and we had tall prairie grasses here on the Wasatch Front. This is Sorghastrum nutans, or I think they call it Indian grass, and this is straight out of the Midwest. This is a major component of wetland prairie fens in the Midwest. We have it here in Utah, scattered on springs throughout the state, and there's one spring left in Utah County that has this species. But bringing some of these plants back could be key to restoring some of these transitional spaces that we have. I won't talk about each of these, but wetland mints. So when I'm constructing wetlands, I'm thinking about all the layers. There's some wetlands that we have that can support 5 canopy layers. I would say the mints can occupy the lowermost canopy layer and the middle canopy layer, but this is just a very excellent species. They all reproduce vegetatively through rhizomes, and rhizomes are great because rhizomes are good at finding the hydrozone that they want. So I would strongly encourage us all to start investigating mints with more detail. And I'll end on these transitional amphibious and mudflat forbs. There's a lot here, and this is a very good mudflat community, and love to talk with any of you about these, but I'm going to just highlight one. So this was historically present on the Wasatch Front and can still be found in a variety of wetlands today, but these are species that can deal with inundated conditions, and then I've also seen them growing right alongside cacti on the Green River. So this is a plant that can deal well with these dynamic conditions and often the water management practices that we currently follow. And it reproduces rather vigorously from stolons. It can be a great host plant for various species of moss and butterflies and is a wonderful pollinator species. So you can see on the bottom left, it's inundated with the Green River. On the right, it was in the upland area, and you can see some of those stolons spreading out over the rocks. It's simultaneously moving into more upland conditions and towards the water, and it's got quite a charming flower, as you can see from the center. And the last one, and I won't spend much time on this, is Canada milk vetch. Walter Cottam reported this as being common on the shores of Utah Lake. I cannot find it today. The only wetland I see this plant is a small one in Willard or Perry, and it's growing out on a peat island in the middle of a pond. And it's growing alongside orchids and Joe Pye weed and some mentha in there. But this is another one of those rhizome-forming forbs that can tolerate very wet and very dry conditions. So I'm trying to find things that can be more dynamic and more flexible with some of our management decisions, while also trying to fulfill some biodiversity capture goals and conservation goals to avoid homogenization. But there's countless plants that I'm working with. Our wetlands are still very diverse. I'd say some of our valley wetlands still support well over 100 to 120 native plant species, but there's very few of those left. And I think figuring out the role of those species and how they can help us with restoration will be very critical. And I think that's it. Oh, Mindy's probably better to answer this, but Utah Pollinator Habitat Program has been a very valuable player with wetland restoration. The wetland kits are largely being used to support agencies. And if you're not familiar with this program, I highly suggest you look up information or talk to Mindy Wheeler, who's here today, or talk to Addie. I think Addie got somewhere in the range of several thousand plants for Utah Lake Authority. And these are plants that could be available to you at no cost, and you can use them within Utah. Is that correct, Mindy? And you can put some of these more pollinator-focused wetland plants into one of your restoration projects. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Blake. And thank you, Mindy, too. Mindy, would you mind just raising your hand so if people want to talk to you about the pollinator program? Amazing efforts.
So, really quick, Utah Lake Authority got 20,000 plants for the wetlands around Utah Lake that are being installed today, actually. We received about 6,000 plants for Great Salt Lake wetlands, so those are going up and down all of Great Salt Lake, and then we got about 1,000 to 2,000 for the Jordan River. So we're really grateful to the Pollinator Habitat Program and helping us with that diversity.
There's a lot going on right now. It's super exciting, and also really grateful to have so much knowledge here today between all of our panelists. So now we're going to have Jeff Klausmann speak from North Fork Native Plants on the species that they offer. They're up in Idaho, and also potentially answering the question of if people wanted some of these less common species that aren't currently offered by North Fork Native Plants, what the steps might be to get those species propagated.
Sure. Thanks, Karin. So I'm Jeff Klausmann. Our nursery is up in Idaho. A lot of the work that we've done and a lot of our experience is north of here. What I'd say is, unfortunately, there's quite a divide between what we heard from Blake and understanding what's out there and then getting some of these species to market. My impression has been a lot of that starts with just a general lack of botanical knowledge, particularly with wetland species. It's becoming more and more difficult to even find botanists who can do flora, and we can get good species lists. And so what that results in are gravitating toward the workhorse species because they're relatively common, easy to grow. We do a lot of work in restoration consulting through our consulting company, and I work with a lot of consultants collaboratively. And when someone's putting together a plant or species list for a restoration, they'll unfortunately ask us, well, what do you recommend? Or they will go to a glossy plant guide and pick out the attributes that they like in the plants. A lot of those plants might not even be appropriate for where they're working. And then give us a list, and oftentimes we have a small percentage of what's on the list. There's a ton of potential here. We could grow most plants. I would say the vast majority of plants, given the lead time and really collaborating on the technical side. So we're not really capped by the ability to grow the plants. It starts with what plants are even there, and do we have appropriate seed or propagule sources for the plants? I think that's a challenge. So a lot of the plants that we offer, we try to stay, unless we're doing a custom grow, which is what we prefer. There are some barriers to that we can get into later. A lot of that is just timing on funding. we have a company policy. We're trying to offer Idaho-sourced material across all of our plants. There's just not that many native plant growers in the region, and so we try to offer Idaho-sourced material. Having said that, we're excited to get plant material from across the West. We've grown plants from California and really across all the western states. I'm excited to hear from Blake and what might be coming as far as some other plants that we can start to play around with and hopefully get to market to improve wetland diversity and vegetative diversity. But that's kind of where it is right now. You know, we offer a dozen to, you know, maybe 20 native wetland plants. A lot of our plants are clonal graminoid type plants, sedges, rushes, bulrushes, spike rushes. And we need to fill the gap on getting the technology and then getting the appropriate seed sources. And I think we could grow a lot more diversity.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks, Jeff, for that. We also have Shane Sterner here from Sterner Seed, and of anybody, I would say Shane is probably the most experienced seed collector in the area. And, you know, wetland seed collector, he has helped a lot of us on our projects, and including for getting seed sources for the work that, for growing plants up at North Fork, for instance. This might be a great future connection. So I'll welcome Shane up here, and could you talk a little bit about the species that you have been collecting and why you collect what you collect, and then if people have new species that they might be interested in, what steps that might take from your point of view?
Absolutely. Thank you for this opportunity. So I mainly collect the workhorse species, so to speak. That's where my main time is spent during the summer. A lot of our limitations as seed collectors are is where do we spend our time? And it all has to do with demand. And when it comes to inland saltgrass, you know, that's usually a pretty steady demand, where the hard stem bulrush, soft stem bulrush, Onley's 3-square, common 3-square, not so much, but it's, you know, it's coming. Alkali bulrush as well. We see a lot of that. Nebraska sedge, meadow sedge. Mainly the reason why we started collecting a lot of these species is because that's what was being asked for. I don't think it was, we were adverse to collecting a lot of these wetland forbs. It's just, it's never really come down the pike. And you know, if you go elsewhere, people that I collaborate with in South Dakota, collectors back east and in the Midwest, it's a lot more common that they incorporate a lot of these things. Like I can't even compete with the prices. You know, for instance, the swamp milkweed, that one right there is actually fairly cheap elsewhere. And you know, for me to do source ID or source material from Utah becomes a lot more challenging and a lot more expensive. And that's kind of the hard part about doing custom collections is, you know, if you're only, you know, looking for a couple pounds or something like that, oftentimes, you know, there's some verification that we need to provide evidence that it came from a locality. And then also there's testing involved and labor. And so by the time we're done with it, it's really just, it kind of evaporates whatever profits that we would make. And so the focus usually is on, unfortunately, on these workhorse species. Again, we're not opposed to doing collections. We've actually been doing some for a project that's being done, I'm told, down in Utah County. I don't know personally much about it, but they've been asking me to collect some material. It's been a lot of fun. It's been interesting. I've learned a ton, absolutely, from the investigation and trying to figure out some of these oddities that are growing. And they seem to be a lot more common than I thought they were. Like but they are disappearing. You know, like there's a site, for instance, of Joe Pye weed that I collected on in Logan, and literally it's getting bulldozed as we speak. And it was a beautiful site. Absolutely tremendous amount of seed was able to be gathered from there. So maybe some benefit will come out of it. But it's one of those things that we're just not getting the demand or the calls for, and so we just don't spend time to collect it because it's just not economically viable. So, is there anything I missed or anything I should?
That was perfect.
Excellent, thank you.
So I think what I would like to do now is just take a couple questions from the audience, if anybody has things specific to species choice, and then we'll move on to our next topic, and we'll have more time for Q&A at the end. But does anybody have any burning questions about species selection for wetland restoration with this amazing wealth of knowledge right here?
Can I ask my question for?
Yeah, Keith would like to ask, yeah, would you mind, so we're gonna have to come up and use the mic first.
Yeah, okay. I have a question for Blake. So thinking of, workhorse species versus all this diversity, what I'm always wondering is how much do these plants depend on the community of plants? So maybe like, is it competition that's driving it or cooperation? And so for folks like me that are working at scale and I'm aiming for this managed succession where I'm gonna have a workhorse species that's gonna cover a lot of acres and then try to bring in biodiversity, like, are there issues with that approach where I have to put out a whole plant community so that those plants can survive interdependently on each other?
That's a really good question, Keith. And I do think that order matters, but at the scales in which you're working on, I don't think we have the capacity to deal with restoring tens of thousands of acres with this highly detailed approach. But something we have to weigh out is if we're successful with restoring spaces with something like saltgrass, for instance, is saltgrass easier to reduce later through some of our herbicide management techniques to create disturbance, or can we use other disturbance methodology like strategic mowing? It's multiple times a year to open up spaces, or grazing by opening up spaces within wetlands. I think that's key to them getting the diversity. But I think within the scales that you're working on, relying on some of these workhorse species just to get the space locked down and try to reduce secondary invasion as much as possible is very important. In spaces that are more dynamic and perhaps smaller in scale, like Powell Slough versus Farmington and Ogden Bays, I think succession management is key. And after working in all these systems for so long, I know who the pioneers are, but I don't know how they all fit together, and I don't know when the graminoids come in. And the balance between, like with Karin's photo, I wanted to spend more time talking about the community structure. But in some of these most healthy wetlands, they do have at least some limited degree of disturbance still present that helps maintain that plant community. And I think in part that's critical. In the past it would have been our native ungulates, but modern days now it's some cows or maybe some mowing. Really happy to see a lot of the consulting agencies implementing mowing is with part of the meadows in which spiranthes occurs. So maintaining these kind of semi-disturbed conditions is critical to maintaining that diversity. But I want to know, as research questions, and part of what I'm interested in working with Karin's lab about is trying to understand the right succession. So I use a modified wetland sod method. I do wetlands in a box. So I attempt to create climax communities from day one. I use a 1 meter by 2/3 meter box, and I grow out a community of plants that might have 25 to 30 species, and then I plant that as a sheet. I'm trying to manage that biodiversity right out of the door, and after 6 years, my oldest boxes still have essentially everything I put in them, because I seemingly struck the right balance, but I need to understand how to make that repeatable. And I'm not to that point yet. But yes, I think we can figure out how to add diversity, and I actually think we have a lot more workhorse species than we realize. I think that we've lost a lot of our workhorse species because they're simply more palatable than saltgrass. And working on getting some of those back, I think, will be very important. Does that kind of help? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take one question from the back, and then we'll move on to our next topic. Eric McCulley.
What's the best way to inoculate these areas with the other things besides plants and seeds? You know, the mycorrhizae, the other fungi, and bacteria.
Great.
You know, you can buy bags of it, which I don't recommend. I usually take little pieces of wetlands and put them in there, but I mean, that's a critical part here. A lot of times we don't talk about.
Okay, I'm going to repeat the question so we have it on record. Lauren, is that helpful? Yep. So how do we inoculate the wetland soils with fungal communities, mycorrhizal communities, bacterial communities? I'm looking at Blake, and Blake's looking everywhere. But I think you're exactly right, Eric, that if we are transferring soil, good soil in some cases, you know, from an experimental standpoint, from people that work with soils in the lab, I know they often just take little bits of native soil, and then they'll have you know, some sterilized soil, and usually it's just a little kind of scoop of that native soil to inoculate a larger volume of soil. So I think if we're growing plants, potentially with some amount of native soil in them, maybe that's happening. Maybe it's probably more sterile potting soil would be my guess.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely afraid of moving the wrong plants around, so we almost never move
Yep.
soil.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that needs to be considered and maybe looked into more about how to do that without contaminating things as well. Moving weed seeds around is a huge issue also. Okay, we're going to move on to our next topic, and we're going to switch out some of our panelists here. So we're going to have Lauren is going to come, and Sam is going to take over the camera. And then David England and Rich Hansen are going to come up, and Jeff gets to stay.
Can I make a quick announcement?
Sure, absolutely.
So when you guys came in, there were books, the Wetland Plants of Great Salt Lake. We just had another set of books delivered. Our friends at the Utah Geological Survey just released a new book that is Wetland Plants of Utah. There's 2 boxes over there. They are free, thanks to the Utah Geological Survey. So speaking of lack of botanical knowledge out there, grab a book and learn about all the wetland plants of Utah.